everyone. If you are joining me for the first time, this is Ramzy Baroud with the Palestinian View. Today's topic is fake neutrality, how Western media language misrepresents Palestinians and shields Israel. While US and Western mainstream and corporate media remain biased in favor of Israel, they often behave as if they are a third neutral party. This is simply not the case. Take the New York Times coverage of the latest Israeli war on Gaza as an example. Its article on August 6, entitled "Israel-Gaza Fighting Flares for a Second Day," is the typical mainstream Western reporting on Israel and Palestine, but with a distinct New York Times flavor. For the uninformed reader, the article succeeds in finding a balanced language between two equal sides. This misleading moral equivalence is one of the biggest intellectual blind spots for Western journalists. If they do not outwardly champion Israel's discourse on security and right to defend itself, they create false parallels between Palestinians and Israelis, as if the military occupier and an occupied nation have comparable rights and responsibilities. Obviously, this logic does not apply to Russia and Ukraine. For the New York Times, and frankly all mainstream Western media, there is no question regarding who the good guys and the bad guys are in that bloody fight. Palestinian militants or terrorists have always been the West's bad guys. Per the logic of their media coverage, Israel does not launch unprovoked wars on Palestinians and is not an unrepentant military occupier or a fascist, racist apartheid regime. This language can only be used by marginal, so-called radical and leftist media, never the mainstream. The brief introduction of the New York Times article spoke about the rising death toll, but did not initially mention that the 20 killed Palestinians at the time include children, emphasizing instead that Israeli attacks have killed a militant leader. When the 6 Palestinian children killed by Israel at that point are revealed in the second paragraph, the article immediately and without starting a new sentence clarified that, quote, Israel said some civilian deaths were the result of militants stashing weapons in residential areas, and that others were killed by, quote, misfired Palestinian rockets. On August 16th, the Israeli military finally admitted that it was behind the strikes that killed the 5 young Palestinian boys in Jabalia. Whether the New York Times reported on that or not matters little. The damage has been done, and that was Israel's plan from the very start. Now, moving on to the BBC. The title of the BBC story of August 16, "Gaza's Children Are Used to the Death and Bombing," does not immediately name those responsible for the death and bombing. Even Israeli military spokesmen, as we will discover later, would agree to such a statement, though they will always lay the blame squarely on the Palestinian terrorists, so-called. When the story finally reveals that the little girl, or a little girl by the name of Layan, was killed in an Israeli strike, the language was carefully crafted to lessen the blame on her Israeli murderers. The girl, we are told, was on her way to the beach with her family when their tuk-tuk passed by a military camp ran by the militant group Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are the words of the BBC, which, quote, at the exact moment was targeted by Israeli fire. The author says nothing of how she reached the conclusion that the family was not the target. One can easily glean from the story that Israel's intention was not to kill Lian. Logically, none of the 17 other children murdered during the 3-day war on Gaza. Besides, Israel has, according to the BBC, tried to save the little girl. Alas, quote, a week of treatment in an Israeli hospital couldn't save her life. Though Israeli politicians have spoken blatantly about killing Palestinian children, and in the case of former Israeli Justice Minister, mind you, Eilat Shaked, quote, the Palestinian mothers who give birth to the little snakes, should be killed as well. The BBC reported, and others who reported on the war have failed to make such mentions. Instead, they quoted Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who reportedly said that, quote, "The death of innocent civilians, especially children, is heartbreaking." Incidentally, Lapid is the one who ordered the latest war on Gaza, which killed a total of 49 Palestinians, mostly civilians, including 17 children. Even a human interest story about a murdered Palestinian child somehow avoided the language that could fault Israel for the gruesome killing of a little girl. Furthermore, the BBC also labored to present Israel in a positive light, resorting to, quote, the occupation army's statement that it was, quote, devastated by Lian's death and that of any civilians, end of quote. The NYT and the BBC have been selected here not because they are the worst examples of Western media bias, but because they are often cited as liberal and in some cases even progressive media. Their reporting, however, represents an ongoing crisis in Western journalism, especially when it comes to Palestine. Books have been written about this subject. Civil society organizations were formed to hold Western media accountable, and numerous editorial board meetings were organized to put some pressure on Western editors, to no avail. Desperate by the unchanging pro-Israel narrative in Western media, some pro-Palestine human rights advocates often argue that there are greater margins within Israel's own mainstream media than that in the US. This is, of course, inaccurate. The misnomer of the supposedly more balanced Israeli media is a direct outcome of the failure to influence Western media coverage on Palestine and Israel. The erroneous notion is often buoyed by the fact that an Israeli newspaper like Haaretz gives marginal spaces to critical voices, like those of Israeli journalists Gedon Levy and Amira Haas. Israeli propaganda, one of the most powerful and sophisticated in the world, however, can hardly be balanced by occasional columns written by few dissenting journalists. Additionally, Haaretz is often cited as an example of relatively fair journalism, simply because the alternatives, Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, and other right-wing Israeli media, are exemplary in their callousness, biased language, and misconstruing of facts. The pro-Israel prejudices in Western media often spill over to Palestine sympathetic media throughout the Middle East and the rest of the world, especially those reporting on the news in English and French. I will not name names, but I think we really have to be very careful regarding this point. Since many newspapers and online platforms utilize Western news agencies, they often inadvertently adopt the same language used in Western news sources, thus depicting Palestinian resistors or fighters as militants, the Israeli occupation army as Israeli defense forces, and the Israeli war on Gaza as flare-ups of violence. In its totality, this language misrepresents the Palestinian struggle for freedom as random acts of violence within a protracted so-called conflict where innocent civilians like Lian and the 16 other children are, quote, caught in the crossfire. The deadly Israeli wars on Gaza are made possible not only by Western weapons and political support, but through an endless stream of media misinformation and misrepresentation. Though Israel has killed thousands of Palestinian civilians in recent years, Western media remains as committed to defending Israel as if nothing has changed. This was Ramzy Baroud with the Palestinian View.